What's up, YouTube?
What's up, Trev?
What's up, YouTube?
How about we just get to asking you some of those?
I'm ready. Music stuff, content, music. Let's do it. Production, music.
What are the basics of music theory that every musician should know?
So when you're first getting into music theory, and the basics can be tough, can be really overwhelming, I just like to think of it like if you've ever done a beginner language class or a beginner math class. It's kind of a mix of, right? You're gonna hear a lot of words in music theory that you've never heard before, and you're gonna have to like do pretty basic, like I'd say second, third grade level math. I think anybody should be able to handle it. But the words can really get in the way. So for basic music theory, I would totally recommend just take it slow, take your time with each word. If you hear a word that you don't know, that's still what I'm doing. Even, 10, 15 years later into music theory is when you hear a word you don't know, just study it. Like think of all the different things you could do with that concept, right? And even still today, the word major in music sounds like it could be such a basic thing. Every single one of us is still working with different ways to use the major scales or major chords and diving into either the scientific or musical relationships involved in just that one word, major.
How can understanding scales and chords improve your playing and songwriting?
Scales and chords are really interesting because we take notes, right, and we try and give them more patterns. But the way that music has been split up into these 12 tones in Western music, we find that those 12 different tones have relationships, and those relationships we've categorized into these things called scales and these things called chords. So scales are individual notes that are laid out in patterns to sound good separately, and we use those scales when putting together melodies or bass lines or things like that, right? One note at a time. Chords, however, are taking those notes, those 12 tones we have, and fitting them at once together and coming up with the most pleasant sound. When it's pleasant, we call it consonant, and when it's not pleasant, we call it dissonant. And there are uses for both of those. So dissonant doesn't mean bad, consonant doesn't mean good, it's just open or clashy, right? So those two things will mix together to basically make up what we call harmony.
You mentioned that we split up into tones. One, how are those decided? And then is there a time in Western music that we don't split into 12 tones?
So the 12 tone split, as they kind of call it in music, right? We have our C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and back to C. We split those up. We also have notes, accidentals, right? In between F, G, A, and B, and then in between C and D, D and E. So that adds up to 12 notes. These 12 notes, that's not the only way to play music, right? Music, the sound that comes out of a note, the fundamental pitch of a note is literally just waves, and those waves come together to produce that fundamental pitch. So the speed of the wave defines the pitch. Of course, if A is 440 hertz and then you start to speed up that wave, the note gets higher. But there are notes in between A and B flat, right? Even though that's just a half step, and some musicians would just think, oh no, those are the only two notes. You can slide up from A to B flat, and you're essentially producing an infinite amount of pitches in between those two notes. A lot of Eastern influenced music, right? I used to play the sitar, and that's kind of all it was based off is a lot of Eastern music uses these kind of quarter sharps and quarter flats in between those notes. But Western music has found it's a lot simpler, and we can produce a lot more of that consonant open music, consistent chord progressions, and I think most importantly, the communication between instruments. So being able to play a guitar, a piano, and a bass at the same time is really positively impacted by only having 12 notes, because all these instruments are way easier to merge together to make our Western music compared to trying to get a sitar to fit with a piano or trying to combine these Eastern and Western instruments.
What are some common chord progressions and how are they used in different genres?
So funny enough, the most fundamental chord progression, and a lot of people will make this mistake, they'll think it's blues, they'll think it's like the 1-4-5 progression, but really I think the most common progression that I see in all different kinds of music is the 2-5-1 progression, because no matter what, once you start to get into advanced harmony, it's really easy to substitute the 5 to the 1, what we call a cadence, which takes the 5 chord, which is our away from home dominant chord, back to the home or tonic chord, as we call it. So another way of doing that is we instead use a 2, 5 to 1 progression in those diatonic chords, triads, seventh chords, whatever, depending on the type and complexity of the music. We use those progressions to substitute, and I've seen it all over worship music. I've seen it in funk, jazz, pop, and it's really starting to become more popular, I think, coming out of the 2010s after we had this big like 6/4, 1/5 type 4-chord songs, things like that. People are starting to get more into using those gospel-y jazz type chords, and the most fundamental chord progression of any jazz music is the 2-5-1.
How do rhythm and timing influence feel of a piece of music?
As far as rhythm and timing goes, I'm gonna kind of refer back to a book that I read back in high school by the legendary Victor Wooten, amazing bass player. If you haven't read it, it's called The Lesson, and it's a wonderful buy, a wonderful read. He basically states, not only with rhythm and timing, but just all of music, that we as a society put so much emphasis on learning notes and learning the relationships between notes, and for a good reason. But what we forget is the other like 90% of music comes from things like articulation, feel, groove, tone. And so rhythm is what takes these notes and really drives the feeling behind them. I like to think of that because notes by themselves can give feeling, right? But without any type of rhythmic drive or pattern behind them, all notes are is really just sound, right? And there's this debate that goes on all the time. What's the difference? Like when does something become music, right? What can you call a song versus what's just noise? I do believe that really anything with a pattern of any kind of rhythm, right? And it can be the wildest patterns, the wildest rhythms, but if it has a pattern in its rhythm and that rhythm is driving the harmony and the melody, that's when it becomes a song. So without rhythm, there's not much drive and therefore there's not much music.
What is the importance of ear training and how can you develop a better musical ear?
Aha, ear training. Ear training is something that a lot of people neglect for way too long. I've worked with people who have been relatively tone deaf. I've worked with people who have perfect pitch, yet I've seen that a lot of people will leave their ear training behind a lot of their other music. And I think it's because you don't touch it, you don't play it, you don't see it, and it literally is using the most important part of our musical selves, which is our ears, yet people neglect it so much. Ear training is what takes all this vocabulary in music theory, and it takes all this practice that we do, and it makes it understandable, right? So imagine if you're learning a language, you're learning French. All you get to do is you get to look at books. And this is what some people complain about this in school, right? Is, all I'm doing is writing and reading the French. And yes, you can somewhat learn a language that way, right? You could argue even that you know French. After years of writing and reading it, you could argue that you know French. But until you hear somebody say the words, speak the language, and immerse yourself in French culture or places that speak French a lot, you can't argue that you're fluent in French. So ear training is what takes the music and it makes it so that we can actually communicate. Communication meaning we can receive the information from other people. We listen to them and we know what is being played to us and we know how to communicate with that. Also, the other piece of communication is, and this is the most magical part of it in my opinion, is when as a musician you start to be able to hear the music you're about to play before you play it. And learning an instrument, that's the most magical thing. That's what makes it possible to improvise. That's what makes it possible to play songs you've never heard before just by looking at things, because you can know what's going to come from your fingers or your voice or your mouthpiece or whatever before you even play it. So that's all in your head, and that music playing in your head is the benefactor of all that ear training. So taking that time to learn the scales, taking that time to hear those scales, hear the chords, hear notes individually, hear the difference between intervals, those 4 things alone without any extra ear training will benefit you a lot. And my favorite kind of little cherry on top is the best thing to practice for ear training is really transcription, because you get a lot of all 4 of those things just by trying to like transcribe a song. I once transcribed like a ton of Beatles music and it taught me so much about like basic chord progressions, bass lines, harmonies, things like that. And just from learning the music of the Beatles and writing it all out, all that ear training made it so that when I was about to play all that music, it kind of just plays out in my head before my fingers or the rest of my brain even does that work.
What are some ways to effectively train your ear?
So you want to get started in ear training and you don't know where to start, I would recommend my favorite website really of all time. I hope they never take it down and it's always been free. musictheory.net has a tool called Tenuto, and there's also an app that you can get. And I would like do it in the car and like while I'm sitting in the bathroom or whatever, and it's just like little ear training exercises, and it goes both ways. So it can be dictation, so you can have to write it down. It can be like just like you tap the notes. So it'll give you a reference note, this is a C, and then you have to tell it, okay, was that a D, was that an E flat, what was it, right? Or it'll play out a scale for you, you have to tell it the scale. And it's like a little game, right? It'll tell you your percentages, it'll tell you how many out of 50 you got, you can change the difficulty. They do a really good job of customizing it, and there's also like further customizations you can do to keep it fresh and make it fun as you go. But just like trying to get good scores at that, you'll realize after a while, like I don't know as much as I think I know. Even after years of doing it, I will still go back from time to time and be like, wow, all these different seventh chords and things like that. I didn't have as much of a grasp on them as I thought I did. After all this time, it's still just fun to try and challenge my last scores. And it really, like, even after a little session, it just gets my brain working in that kind of locked in ear type of thinking. And all that ear training will pay off when it's time to read a chart, or it's time to transcribe some music, or it's time to try and improvise and reharmonize on the fly. All those things will pay off just from doing those little exercises.
How can you effectively use dynamics and articulation to enhance musical expression?
So on the topic of the different elements and puzzle pieces that go into making a musical performance, right? Everybody thinks of notes as the most important thing. Funny enough, like as a producer, we always use this like loudness meter and loudness measurement to talk about how music stacks up to other things. But what we always use is we want to preserve the dynamic range. Now, why do we want to do that? Because yes, notes can make music interesting, right? But dynamics and articulations are really what add to the music and make it super interesting to listen to consistently, because when everything's the same volume the whole time, we don't have enough layering of interest in our music to allow it to really connect with the listener on an emotional level. And that's why, like, you hear, okay, think about a driving part of the song. What is the pianist sitting there doing, right? They're hammering on the keys, like super pop song, like, yeah, they're hammering on the keys. And then the song will go to this somber, soft outro. And now what do you see the pianist doing? Well, they're playing a little bit higher up on the keyboard. They're playing quieter notes. They're going back and forth kind of in this wavy motion of hitting a strong low chord and then kind of twinkling up on the top of the keys. And that's really what it is. It's not about being dynamically loud the whole time or dynamically soft the whole time. But what gives music interest is the relationship and the flow between the two. I could go into that as a drummer, right? So we call it kind of interdynamics, right? Whereas it can be really cool if we pound two floor toms and then we give a little twinkle on the ride cymbal or something in between, because you've got a little bit of range there. And the variability really gives that music interest on top of the rhythms you're playing and on top of the pitches you're playing.
What are some tips for sight reading music more efficiently?
So sight reading is really interesting because over the years, sight reading has really evolved. Back even when I was a kid, there was such an emphasis on reading notes, right? Reading treble clef, reading bass clef. And I learned how to do those things. I would say I'm pretty below average for the musical level I'm at. I'm pretty below average at sight reading. It's probably the thing that I've left behind the most. And it's only because, yes, I know what the notes are and I can like read. I struggle with reading two hands of piano at the same time. But for piano, I've developed kind of such a high theoretical knowledge that I like to see chord symbols and I like to read kind of the changes like you would in a real book rather than read a lot of classical piano. And that's really what it comes down to, is what style of music do you want to learn and what writing and transcription of that music is going to better help you practice it. So for classical styles where there's a lot of like both hands doing very specific interactions of harmony, it's going to be really beneficial for you to get good at reading notes on a staff. For guitar, it could be tab. For drums, it could be light notation or even those little squares that you shade in to see what drum to hit on what 16th note subdivision. And for a lot of music, it's just a lead sheet, right? My worship team at church, they will just use chords the entire time, either a lead sheet or guitar chords written down on a sheet underneath the lyrics. And for that type of music, it makes complete sense. And somebody could get very, very good at their instrument doing that while not reading a single note off of the staff. But I will say this, diversifying will always make you a better musician. So never shut one thing out of your repertoire. Never say, oh, I'm never gonna read sheet music, or I'm never gonna read chords, or I'm never gonna read tab because this is cheating, this isn't gonna make you better. The truth is, it'll all make you better, and some of it is more efficient for some types of music than it is for others. So try and key in on that and ask yourself, what piece of paper is gonna help me learn this song the best? That's all it is.
How do you approach harmonizing melodies?
So when approaching a melody and trying to write chords underneath it, which is a common way to write a song, right? You've got a melody in your head, kind of an earworm. You're listening, you've got something really catchy written, but then you're like, oh, I don't know what chords to put underneath this. First of all, you want to look to what we call voices inside of harmony first and understand that chord progressions are really just like a bunch of melodies put together. If you study voice leading and you know that, okay, if I go E minor to G, two notes are shared there, right? We share a G and we share a B, but the E changes to a D. And with that chord change, you just created a melody. So one option is look at your melody and just put chords underneath the notes that have those notes in them. A lot of the times, if you know nothing about chord progressions and diatonic chords and things like that, it'll sound pretty weird, but honestly, I've seen some people come up with some really cool and inventive chord progressions by kind of not knowing the pre-existing patterns. And when people do know the pre-existing chord progressions, they kind of default to that like 6-4-1-5 thing all the time. So don't do that either. It's really fun to start with a melody and just kind of try and pick apart different chords that could go underneath there. And then ask yourself, how dissonant is this? Or how consonant is this? Does it sound clashy? Is it really jarring? Because that's what chords will do, right? If they're not all from the same scale, those chords will feel very far from home. And if they are in the same scale, those chords will feel kind of right at home, and the song will kind of just float in this major scale space, so to speak. But I would encourage, if you're trying to go for a certain vibe, look up what chords bring out sadness, and it'll often tell you minor chords will bring out sadness, or which chords will bring out attitude and that kind of feeling, and kind of like a mystifying feeling. Like you could use the Dorian scale for that, and you can look up the modes, and all of this stuff is readily available online when you look up those chords, and then it's just finding what key you're in. So match those chords to the key, and you're gonna find a really interesting chord progression, something that's really unique and not overused for your melody, just by a quick Google search of what emotion you want and what chords or scales will match that.
What about like vocal harmony?
So you're a vocalist and you want to harmonize over a melody. You have no idea where to start. Well, first, make sure you can sing the melody. That's the biggest thing. If you don't know the melody you're about to harmonize with, you're gonna have a lot of trouble trying to find that harmony, because the biggest thing I see a lot of people with harmony leaving out is harmonic motion. And harmonic motion is just like melodic motion, right? The melody moves up and down in steps and skips, and the harmony needs to do the same. And it's not always exactly locked in with that melody. It is locked in with the melody rhythmically, but then with the harmony, which means the chords of the songs, harmonically, right? So the notes you pick have to match the chords, not necessarily the melody exactly. So when you're starting to learn, it's all about understanding the key of the song, the scale you're in, and then the steps and the skips of that melody. And if you learn those three things and you have that language in your head, it's just like improvising, right? You can hear it in your head first. I can hear the melody in my head, and I can hear the note that I'm about to sing, and you should be able to hear whether or not it's going to line up with the chords that are played underneath that note. So I'm making it sound a lot easier than it is in just a short amount of time here, because it takes a while to develop that. But the first step is just try and sing harmony along with songs that you know. Melodies you know really well, sing along with them in the car, in the shower, and try first, sing the melody for a little bit, and then try and add a harmony. But ask yourself, take that time with some of those songs, learn the chords, learn and write out the motion of the melody. How many notes does this go up at a time? Because as much as I've seen people get pretty decent just doing it by ear, and the ear is very important. Like if you don't have a good ear, you're not going to learn how to sing harmony well. On top of that, if you really understand the notes, the motion, the vocabulary, the things like that, you'll have a better grip on being able to come up with those notes on the fly, especially looking at sheet music. You'll have a better grasp of coming up with those notes in those situations where the harmony can get a little weird, or or a little jazzy, or the chords aren't very consistent, chords can change. So those types of people who learn just by ear, they'll do really good when the song's got 4 chords, and then when things get even a little bit more complicated, everything breaks down. So you don't want to be one of those. You want to be somebody who understands the music that they're singing, somebody singing harmony who could tell you exactly what note they're singing at what time, because they know what key the song's in, they know what the melody's doing, they know what a third sounds like in the key of C, they know what a sixth sounds like when it's time to go to the 4 chord in the key of C, and they're going to sing the third. So all those little mathematical things, it should be fun, because what it does is it gives your brain clarity on what notes you're singing.
What are modes in music theory, and how can they be applied creatively?
So there's this thing that gets thrown around online all the time because it's pretty clickbaity and everybody is interested in it, and that's modes. And it's like, how do I learn modes? How do I use modes? How do I get better at using modes? I really like to think of modes as just ways to use the major scale differently, because that's really what they are. Every different types of scale can have modes, and yet the only ones that are really talked about online that much are the major scale modes. So our major scale modes are Ionian, which is literally just major, and then going up one step at a time would be Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian, Aeolian, which is our natural minor scale, Locrian, and then we get back to Ionian. So really it's just different ways to use the major scale to bring out different emotions and attitudes in our music, right? As if you think of it as a painter kind of using different perspectives. But I wouldn't spend too much time on it if you're really a beginner. The major scale has years and years of content to work with and to practice and to master. And a lot of people don't do that before they move to modes. And you can work a lot with just the interaction of the major scale. And if you really do want to work with modes, I would seek out songs that are written in that mode rather than try and bring a different mode to a song that's really just written for the major scale. So a few examples of that could be like a lot of Stevie Wonder uses that minor 1 to the major 4, which that is our Dorian mode. It's not natural minor because the 6 in the key is going to be a natural 6 in these Dorian songs. So it's really fun to kind of solo in that Dorian mode. And that's a very practical way to learn those modes at first, is just go find a song that's in that mode the whole time, and really you're just practicing another kind of type of scale. Thinking of it as a major scale and developing your skills around major scales are going to benefit you a lot more than being stuck on modes right away.
How do you approach transcribing music by ear, and why is it valuable?
So when you're about to transcribe music, I think the most important thing to start with is pick a tool. Pick a tool that you really like and get used to using it. Get used to using it quickly. I like Sibelius and I like Logic for using these things because I'm good at both of them. I've used them for other reasons. I have a Stream Deck profile where I've got all my macros, my hotkeys saved, so that the stuff that enters my brain, I can get it into the computer very quickly. People 100 years ago who wanted to transcribe, they could only use a pencil, and that took forever. And honestly, I would not be nearly as good at music as I am today if I lived 100 years ago, because transcription would have been relatively impossible. I have shaky hands and I do not have clean handwriting, and so my transcription skills would have been very below average. But once you have the tool, it's really just about trying to line up the stuff you've learned from every aspect of music. So start with your music theory and then move to the instruments that you work on. Pair those things together and just listen to things that you're interested in. What it was for me is I would hear things like Corey Henry's Lingus solo and Snarky Puppy, and I'm like, I have no idea what's going on right now. And that's what transcription is for as a learning tool for a musician. Like when I listen to a country song, nothing against country, I love country, but when I listen to a country song and I hear the 3 chords that are played and the simple melody, I know exactly what's going on. I can typically guess what's going to come next, even if I've never heard the song before, because there are certain patterns that they're working with. When I heard that Corey Henry solo in Lingus, I had no idea what was coming next. I had no idea what he was doing. I couldn't even pick out what chords were going on or what harmony he was implying. And so transcription is the answer. If I transcribed that, I'm like, oh, I see what he did there. And a lot of the stuff I still flat out don't understand. And that solo alone would take me years to kind of analyze and figure out, apply to my own improvisation. So it's really a balance of like, how detailed are you going to get with the transcription? What are you trying to learn from it? But I just think it's a wonderful tool to take something that's so foreign sounding to you that you don't understand the chords or the harmony for, or even the melody for, and demystify it in a way.